Landlords in New York City are finally taking their case against rent control to the United States Supreme Court. And they say that politicians can make tenants and taxpayers alike happy by shifting the cost of providing below market rate housing onto a minority of building owners. And that is why they pass rent control laws. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the case that the New York landlords have against the 2019 New York rent stabilization law. Okay, it's basically a rent control law that took away landlords' ability to raise rents when they did major improvements to their properties, right? They basically have cut away every single way that landlords would be able to raise their rents, and the results are disastrous, okay? They are putting landlords into the poorhouse. They are making it so that the buildings are in terrible shape, terrible condition, and they have no way to recuperate the cost or recover the costs, okay? It's absolutely horrible. And so what's happening is a lot of landlords, they have units that are in horrible disrepair. Rather than fixing those units up, since they won't be able to raise the rents to cover the cost of renovations, they're just keeping them empty. Okay, I mean, that's pretty bad when you say, hey, I would lose a fortune if I rehab this unit and then rented it out. So I'm just not going to rehab it. You know, like you think about it, you know, if you have let's say a very old building and you had a tenant living in there for a long period of time, which is the case in a lot of these rent control units, you know, people live in them for 30, 40 plus years, right? And you're like, okay, they finally have moved on. All I got to do is just fix this thing up and I could put it back on the market at a much higher rent. Well, they don't let you do that anymore. Okay, they say, hey, you know, you have to keep those rents artificially low for the next tenant as well. And you're sitting there like, okay, so I'm going to put 50 grand into fixing up this unit and then still only be able to charge that super low rent that the previous tenant had. Yeah, that's not profitable. There's no way that you can make the math work. And any landlord, any bank lender would tell you this sort of thing. That's why these properties are oftentimes going to fall into foreclosure, okay? Especially when we're talking about commercial lending. Commercial lending is a lot different than regular residential lending. So you might own these buildings and it doesn't have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage on it. You might have 5 years fixed at a certain rate and then you have to refinance. Okay, you have to refinance because, you know, the total loan amount will come due after the period of 5 years. So, you know, I have loans like that right now. So I know that, hey, you know, you could get hit with these much, much higher interest rates and suddenly find that, hey, the rents that we were getting paid, they are not going to cover the new loan amount, okay? And that would put a lot of landlords upside down. So, you know, we might see a huge amount of commercial real estate foreclosures coming up in a place like New York especially. Okay, this is bad. This is very, very bad. And, you know, with all the talks of the bank failures and all that other stuff, you know, we have to get rid of these rent control laws. We do. And I don't think that this is constitutional. I just don't. I think that it's a taking by the government. That's what I personally believe. Just like the eviction moratorium was a taking. But, you know, I want the Supreme Court to see this. And if they disagree with me, fine. But, you know, at least there will be a decision at that point. Oh, man, what a tricky situation this whole thing is. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. What do you think when this case hits the Supreme Court? What do you think they're going to do? Now, I know that the Supreme Court is more conservative right now, right? But there have been many issues that even the conservative Supreme Court has kicked back to the lower court. So I believe it would be the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, right? And if they kick the case back, the landlords, you know, they've basically lost at that point, okay? So I want them to actually read the case. I want them to make a decision. Now, if the decision is made, will they cut rent control law in New York? I don't know. That's a tough one. Like there is some sort of precedent for rent control in this country. I don't think it's right, but yes, there is a precedent. It has been implemented for a very, very long period of time. And keeping that in mind, the Supreme Court might look at that and say, hey, yeah, this has been in place since like World War II, so we're going to allow it to stay in place. I wouldn't think they would, but, who knows? Who knows? But anyway, let's get into this article. This article is coming from therealdeal.com, and it says, Landlords take rent challenge to Supreme Court. Owners' last best shot to end rent stabilization in New York. Come on. Let's get rid of this stuff. But anyway, let's get into the article. Nearly 4 years ago, landlord groups filed a federal lawsuit challenging New York's newly minted rent law, expecting to fail at every level until the last one. On Monday, with the anticipated trail of lower court losses behind them, the groups took their fight to the highest court in the land. The Rent Stabilization Association, the Community Housing Improvement Program, and a few individual landlords filed a petition asking the U.S. Supreme Court to consider their challenge to New York's rent stabilization law. The groups first filed a lawsuit in July 2019, alleging that the state law, which regulates leases at nearly 1 million apartments throughout New York City, violated the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause and the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. Yeah, and, the saddest part about this whole situation is that it took them 4 years to get up to the Supreme Court. So this law passed in 2019. That's when they filed their lawsuit, and they've been, spending tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars fighting this for 4 years. While, you can see why I say don't ever put your hopes in, like a court decision or anything like that. Go where you're treated better. Don't waste your time with a place like New York. If this is the only way that you can possibly maybe make some money, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. It's too risky. And, the balance on the Supreme Court changes. That's one of the worst parts right there. So you could start your case back in 2019 and be a more conservative, more landlord-friendly court, who's more concerned with property rights. And by the time it actually gets up there, guess what? Now it's a very left-leaning progressive that, wants the whole world to be socialist. And guess what? Now you instantly lost your case. Yeah. So I feel for these landlords. I want them to win, but man, the real message behind, all this battle is go where you're treated better. That means go somewhere where there is no rent control. Go somewhere where landlords do have good property rights. Yeah, you can make a ton of money in New York. Yeah, the properties are worth a lot. Yeah, the market is humongous, right? But you can have all that taken away in an instant in these places, okay? Because they hate you there. They hate you. They want to strip your property rights away from you there, and they will tell you that to your face. Meanwhile, you're like, okay, well, where do I go? Where do I go? Well, you go down to Texas. The city of Houston, metropolitan area, about 7 million people. I know that's not nearly as big as New York, but that's still a huge area. City itself is 2 million people. It's in a state that is very landlord friendly, has a ton of property rights. That's just an example. There's places all over the country that are better to invest than New York. But man, let's continue with this article. The complaint, which not only challenged the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, but rent stabilization as a concept, charged that the law deprives owners of the use of their properties while also failing to address New York's affordable housing shortage. To date, the courts have not agreed. Most recently, the Second Circuit affirmed the New York Eastern District's court's dismissal of their case, as well as a similar suit brought by mom-and-pop owners Dino Demos and Vasiliki Pangolius. In their petition, the groups asked the court to affirm a fundamental limitation against undue burden on select property owners, that is, landlords forced to provide public assistance to tenants through low rents, lease renewals, and succession rights. Yeah, and that's exactly the point that I make. I've made this point so many times. They want landlords to be a public housing provider. They want to force you to be a social service provider, a homeless shelter off of your dime for all of these people. And you know what? The worst part of rent control is it's not means tested, right? Which means that you have to be you have to subsidize the housing of people who don't need subsidized housing. They make plenty of money to be able to pay their own rent, and yet they're living up in rent control units. So I did a little research on rent control up in New York, and guess what? 22% of the people who live in rent control units in New York City make over $100,000 a year. Now, there's very, very few people in my mind who need subsidized housing when they are making six figures, okay? Even though, like, I know New York is a more expensive place, right? But the median household income in New York, I mean, I'll have to look it up because, you know, I don't think it's even $100,000. I believe it's lower than that. So it just blows my mind that they want to force landlords to subsidize everyone's living and basically provide a government benefit to these people, you know, which is cheap housing. That is so dumb. And that's exactly what they're saying in this lawsuit. That's why this is a taking, okay, from the government, taking a private property for public use without compensation. That's exactly what this is. And maybe the Supreme Court will see it that way. I don't know. But, you know, my hope is that landlords win, okay? And if it does win, you know, if they do win, maybe it will mean that every single rent control policy throughout the entire country is illegal as well.